In July of 1861, 7 soldiers set off from this army base headed home to Texas. Their plight is immortalized on the map of Utah more than a century and a half later. I'll tell you that story and the name of the place that remembers them next. In the late 1850s, President James Buchanan, fearing an insurrection from Mormon settlers, built up the presence of the U.S. Army in the Utah Territory. The Army built Camp Floyd, a lonely remote outpost in the desert about 50 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. At its height, more than 3,000 troops were garrisoned at Camp Floyd, making it the single largest assemblage of American troops at that time. No base anywhere had more U.S. soldiers than Camp Floyd. That insurrection that was feared never materialized, and in 1861, the priorities for the U.S. Army changed overnight when the first shots for the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Suddenly, keeping 3,000 men quartered in remote Utah was a luxury that the United States could afford no longer. Newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln ordered the troops to be sent home. So the militiamen left Camp Floyd in groups, headed back to their home states. It was the nature of the Civil War which made this troop withdrawal unusual. All of these soldiers had served together under one flag in defense of one country, but now they were headed to their respective home states where they would take up arms against each other. It was under this milieu that the 7 soldiers at the center of today's story headed out, probably in a larger group of 40 or so men. Their names are still unknown even today. In fact, little is known about them, other than the fact that they had left Camp Floyd and were headed for Texas. It was the middle of summer as they embarked on a 1,000-mile trek through some pretty rugged terrain that would probably take about 3 months. However, as you might have guessed, the men didn't make it to Texas. In fact, they barely made it to the edge of Utah County. Now in Utah, any month of the year can bring snowfall, and although it's uncommon, these soldiers who were headed for Texas encountered a summertime snowstorm. As the group climbed up out of the Great Basin to cross the Wasatch Range, they reached a place called Grassy Pass, about 35 miles southeast of Provo. At 7,500 feet in elevation, their progress was halted by a blizzard, even though it was July. 7 of the men in the group, or maybe it was 6 soldiers and a 14-year-old, but 7 people didn't survive that snowstorm. When the storm had passed, their comrades buried the remains of those 7 men in shallow graves on Grassy Pass, and then continued onward toward Texas. Now that could have been the end of the story, as the event was largely forgotten. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, it wasn't even recorded. For the next 20 years, no one remembered or recalled the tragedy of these 7 men. But things changed in the early 1880s when the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad was building westward to connect Denver to Salt Lake City. Up on top of Grassy Pass, their survey crews discovered those shallow graves left from 2 decades earlier. When the railroad was completed and began operating, the timetable showed that the station here had a new name. It was not Grassy Pass, it was Soldier Summit. And that's what we call it even today, Soldier Summit. But there's even more to this story. The railroad workers marked the gravesites of those 7 fallen soldiers. It's possible that they moved them too to get them out of the path of the rails, but the railroaders created and left behind a more permanent and formal resting place for those 7 souls, and it's still there today at the crest of Soldier Summit. It's a small plot, pretty close to the main highway. US 6 is a major route connecting the Wasatch Front to Moab and Colorado, and it summits the Wasatch Range at Soldier Summit. But my hunch is that the vast majority of the travelers traversing that pass have absolutely no knowledge about why it's called Soldier Summit, or that the graves of those soldiers whose tragedy gave name to the summit are located right off the road. The signage is minimal, and it requires a little bit of walking to find them because the graves are on the opposite side of the railway from the highway. But here, down this well-marked path, along the babbling headwaters of Soldier Creek, is this respectful makeshift cemetery, which is the final resting place of those men. There's a guest book for visitors to sign in and pay respect, and small headstones which proclaim simply that these are unknown U.S. soldiers. Sometimes people leave flowers here. When I visited, someone had placed little American flags on the graves. It's a peaceful, solemn site where the solitude is broken only by the distant din of traffic on the highway and the occasional rumble from a passing train. The one thing that seems incongruous to me is the tattered flag which flaps over the cemetery. That's a Confederate flag. Now, of course, this is not the familiar Confederate battle flag like you might have seen on the Dukes of Hazzard. Instead, this flag is the flag of the government from the Confederacy. The reason that I find this incongruent is because the men interred here were not Confederate soldiers. They were American soldiers, just like it says on the headstones. Only a few days before the soldiers perished, they had been on duty at a U.S. Army base serving alongside other U.S. soldiers. Now, yes, it's true that they were on their way to Texas, and yes, it's likely that they would have been pressed into service as Confederate soldiers after they arrived back in Texas, but none of that happened. The men died here as American soldiers, and I kind of wish that there was an American flag flying here too. Lastly, I remind you that all of this is private property. The owners do allow passage for visitors to the grave sites, but please be respectful so that that does not have to be changed. So that's the story of Soldier Summit, a place named for people whose names have been lost to history, but integral to the modern map of Utah. If you learned something from this video, please give it a thumbs up so that YouTube will share it with others too. And if you enjoy the content on my channel, I would be honored to have you as a subscriber. This is Postcard Dan in Wasatch County, Utah.